Okay, I'm back. We've talked about the run-up to the war. Pearl Harbor happened. Suddenly we're at war with not only Japan, but Germany and Italy. And we have to prepare because we've spent the past 20 years not preparing. So we're going to take a look at the home front first during this discussion of World War II. Mobilization for the war and the home front, what goes on. Well, we go from, much like this past 2 or 3 weeks, guys, it's a great analogy. 3 weeks ago, coronavirus was something in the very back of our minds, if at all. Suddenly it's here. Suddenly school's closed. Suddenly we are quarantined at home. Suddenly we are social distancing. Suddenly the entire landscape of what we do has changed. No more track, no more baseball, no more softball, no more major league sports. The new normal, as they say. Well, this is the new normal, and it's a war. And so we're going to take a look at how that worked. Well, clearly, big changes. Uncle Sam gets busy. You can see he's putting on his work clothes. And women, the very iconic poster woman of World War II, Rosie the Riveter, comes to the rescue in terms of production. So a bunch of things change overnight. On December 7th, as we know, the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor. December 8th, as we know, the United States declares war on Japan. On December 11th, as we know, Germany and Italy declare war on the United States. And as of December 12th, 1941, we have a war in 2 hemispheres that we're completely unprepared for. Roosevelt says, I didn't want this. There's been a lot of charges that because he was an internationalist, maybe he really did want to get into the war, but he certainly never wanted to get into this war where it was clear that we were going to be on the losing side for 6 months to a year before we could produce enough war material to actually fight back effectively. And that was the case. One thing the government did is immediately institute something they called Cost Plus. And Cost Plus was a system where the government would draw up specs for something, let's say a Jeep, and say that this Jeep will cost, I don't know what it costs to make a Jeep, to produce a Jeep in 1941, but let's say it cost $800. Okay, $800 for $870, we will pay you $870 for 1 billion Jeeps. You're going to make a lot of money. You know you're going to have a profit. It won't be a huge profit, but you won't lose money. You'll make money over and above all of your expenses. And so people jumped at the chance to make Jeeps or artillery shells or whatever was needed for the war effort on the basis of Cost Plus. So private industry jumped in. Another aside about coronavirus, it said we need respirators. If the government issued a Cost Plus that you build the ventilators and we will pay you whatever it costs plus, please make 1 million of them today, I bet you we would soon have production of ventilators. I think I said respirators earlier, ventilators. There you have a tank assembly plant just 6 months after Pearl Harbor as assembly lining out tanks just the way that Henry Ford assembly lined out Model Ts back in the 1920s. This happens to be a Chrysler plant that is converted over to tanks. Innovation, again, something that you have in a time of crisis. A man by the name of Henry Kaiser developed plans for something called the Liberty Ship, which was used for everything but for hospital ships, troop ships, supply ships, and they made 10,000 of these things over the course of the war. They did them in a revolutionary way at a time that everything was riveted together strongly. These were welded together, said they wouldn't last, and they lasted better than the other ones. And they made many of them. There were many regulatory bodies. The government micromanaged this as far as classwork. Do we need to know what these various entities did? No. We just need to know that they existed, and yes, they did manage most aspects of life. There's a war on, as they used to say. Now, the question is, who did the work? There's 16 million Americans serve in the armed forces. Somebody has to fill that labor force gap. Now, we've had a labor force that hasn't been working at 100% because we're in the Great Depression. But we've been climbing our way, clawing our way through the 30s up into the late 30s, out of the Depression, and now, over the course of a short period of time, much of the manpower, and I do mean manpower, is gone. Who are the new sources of labor? They're listed there. Minorities, Hispanics, largely Mexicans and Guatemalans, other Central Americans, and African-Americans, of which there's millions right here, many consigned still to sharecropping. We had a great migration of some African Americans north in the First World War to work in defense factories, and many of them stayed in northern cities, so they're there, and many more will come. There'll be a renewed great migration. And women, who are everywhere, half the population, but as we know, women don't work. Those are air quotes. So let's look at the situation of African Americans first, okay? One thing is that African Americans in the Jim Crow era are lower than second-class citizens, in which they have almost no rights of citizenship. We've talked about that over the course of the class. But one African American says, the Army Jim Crows us. You know what that means? Second-class, prejudicial laws and rules and regulations. Employers and labor unions shut us out. Lynching continues. We're disfranchised. We can't vote for our government. And spat upon. What more can Hitler do? So there's, in a lot of ways, no real incentive for an African American in the 1940s to jump up and say, yay, I'm going to risk my life on behalf of a country that treats me in this way. But in fact, that's an atypical statement. African Americans jumped at the chance to support the country and to serve the country during this crisis. Why? Well, one was something that was an actual planned campaign by African American leaders at the time. It's called Double V. V as in victory, V as in victory. Victory over Hitler and fascism and Nazism, victory over prejudice and discrimination at home. The thinking being, we're going to go and fight for liberty in Europe, and we're going to come home, and because we've all been fighting for liberty in Europe, it will dawn on others, and we will have proved ourselves admirably that therefore there should be liberty for African Americans as well. If we can fight for Polish people, we should be able to fight for freedom and equality here in our own country. That's the thinking. And it's bought into by most African Americans, and most Americans, at least at the time of the war. But not everybody. And in fact, it was hard for African Americans on the home front to be much of a contributor because of attitudes like the one you see on the screen right there. The president of North American Aviation, an aircraft company, says, while we are in complete sympathy with the Negro, it is against company policy to employ them as aircraft workers. Now think about that, let that sink in. I'm a rocket scientist, but I'm black, they don't want me. Why? Well, it's our policy not to hire people like you. They go on, regardless of their training. But there will be some jobs as janitors for Negroes. Very prejudicial, and it's cutting off your nose, as the saying goes, to spite your face, because if you have trained or trainable people to produce what you need to produce, and you don't hire them because of the color of their skin or their gender or their ethnicity, you are cutting yourself out of a labor force that you need. That's one aspect of it. But the other aspect is, obviously, this is a denial of opportunity and a denial of allowing people to fulfill their role as citizens in the country. what African Americans think about this. Here's a name you should know and remember, a great leader, African American leader of the mid 20th century, guy by the name of A. Philip Randolph. He was the president of the largest African American union, one of the Pullman Car Porters Association, and he was organizing a march on Washington. Now you may know from the back of your mind that there was a march on Washington during the Civil Rights Movement where Martin Luther King got up and made his I Have a Dream speech, 1963. Yes, if you've heard of that. A. Philip Randolph, who was still around in 1963, dragged this same idea from the 1940s and presented it in the 1960s, and the march happened. But in 1941, this is before Pearl Harbor, we're not in the war, but we're the great arsenal of democracy. A. Philip Randolph sees this same thing. We are not going to hire any African Americans regardless of training, and he's about to do something about it. Franklin Roosevelt, the president, says, whoa, I don't know if we can really have a march on Washington. We're gearing up to do all this work. Why don't we fix this problem between ourselves here? And he sits down with Randolph, and the two of them get together, and the result is something very significant. Make a note of it. Roosevelt issues something called Executive Order 8802, very famous. It created the FEPC, the Federal Employment Practices Committee. You still today can see the initials FEPC on fair employment practices. That's because this committee over the years morphed into a permanent commission. From that point onward, African Americans were hired to all federally funded jobs and to federal positions themselves from that point forward. 8802 says, no discrimination in employment of workers in defense industries or government work because of race, creed, color, or national origin. So it covers the waterfront, really, of types of discrimination. Doesn't mention gender, but we'll get to that another time. The slides, which you'll have these slides, just explains FEPC and what it did do. But you can see in a shorthand way what it did do. It was a way to equalize the labor force. Its intent was not really as a civil rights tool, although it was a civil rights tool. It was a we need workers tool, and we want everyone who does want to work and can work to win this war. You can see a poster, a government poster, shows not only African American man working, it's an integrated, a desegregated workplace. That's revolutionary, 1941. It'd be revolutionary in 1951 or 1961, but it's introduced now. And African Americans worked in all aspects of the defense industry during the war. Talked about earlier, Rosie the Riveter. Here are African Americans who also, wearing two hats, if you want to say it that way, are Rosie the Riveters themselves, shipyard workers. In addition, African Americans rally to join the armed forces. Joe Louis, the most famous African American athlete of that era, is a recruiter, serves in the armed forces, but is a recruiter basically because he is, if Joe Louis is doing it, man, I want to do it. You may have heard about the Tuskegee Airmen, a very famous flying fighter, Air Corps fighter squadron with great recognition of their heroism during the war, and down to regular foot soldiers. Okay, African Americans are recruited, they are utilized, They revel in the fact that they're useful, and they serve in great numbers and very, very well. There's another program you should be aware of and jot down, the Bracero program. This is a program that was going to open our borders. We hear a lot today, if you follow politics, about whether we should have quote-unquote open borders along the Rio Grande between the United States and Mexico. Well, here the United States opens the border and rolls out a welcome mat and says, Bracero worker program, please come into our country and do work. What could you do? You could work in a factory, you could work for the government, you could work in agriculture, you could work in mining and logging. There's a ton of things in the southwestern part of the country, which is the easiest place to get to, crossing the Rio Grande, that you can do and we want you to do. And thousands, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans and other Central Americans, mostly Mexicans, come into the United States over this program during World War II. Railway workers, farm workers, other workers. This reignites the Great Migration that we've talked about before, and we have African Americans pouring northward, and those in this, I guess you would call the western part of the South, Texas, Arkansas, Louisiana, make their way to places like LA and San Diego to work in defense factories. And it's even a bigger wave, a tsunami of African Americans moving to do this work. The repercussion, though, is that this is all not always met with a welcome mat amongst the factories and the shipyards and the railroad yards where these African Americans go to do their work. There's a series of clashes and, as they called them at the time, race riots that went on in the 1940s. The biggest and worst was in Detroit in 1943, but they were all over. War production factories in the South hired black workers in huge numbers because of FEPC, even in the Jim Crow South, but they remained strictly segregated, and that actually worked as a production booster. You'd have a crew building a ship at this dock and a crew building a ship at that dock, and one was white and one was black, and they'd go to the black workers and say, those white workers are better than you. They're finishing their ship much more quickly than you are. But, no, they're not. They double down their work. Then they go to the other dock and say, you know, those black guys, they're doing a better job than you guys, and you've been here for 5 years, and they're just hired. Well, no, they're not. So they would get into these races, these competitions, and produce more ships and produce more whatever they were producing. It didn't make for, camaraderie either, though. And so there was a high tension, racial tension throughout the war, kind of set the stage for what we will talk about, assuming we're still in school, I guess, when we get to the civil rights movement of the 50s and 60s. Mexican Americans, this Braceros program, flock into the country. Was a program that was started in the war. It lasted all the way to 1964. It was something that we really wanted Mexicans and other Hispanics into the country to do work, but again, tension arose. So this is an interesting but not very enlightening type story. The fashion of the day was something called the zoot suit. There you can see zoot suits. You can see they're baggy and nothing I'd want to wear, but they were the fashion of the late 30s and 1940, 1941. They were what you wore if you were a styling kind of guy. Some of these people, whether they be Hispanic or African American, this might be the first nice new suit that they got. And they got a zoot suit because, hey, I got some money to spend, I'm working in the defense factory, I'm being patriotic, and I want to spend my money and look cool. The problem was there's a war on now, and the government issues a bunch of please don't use so much stuff type announcements. Food, gasoline, whatever it might be. Well, one of it was cloth, and they introduced a so-called victory suit, which would be a trimmer look than what this is. Use less cloth. Zoot suits use more cloth. These guys just bought them. They're are hanging out at the street corner on Friday night because they got their zoot suits on. U.S. naval personnel that come into LA or San Diego on shore leave don't take kindly to it. They see this as unpatriotic. They get what looks like baseball bats, pieces of wood, and they go around and they find zoot suiters and they beat the tar out of them. This was in LA. The LA zoot suit riots lasted for weeks. Police didn't do anything to stop the violence, which is not a good look. What they did do eventually is outlaw zoot suits, not outlaw beating people in the head with cudgels, but outlaw the suits. And there were copycat riots in places like San Diego and San Francisco and San Antonio, where Fort Sam Houston is, and in various places where there would be likely to be zoot suit wearing, recently got a paycheck Mexican young men and armed forces personnel. Once they beat these guys, they'd rip their zoot suits off and throw them on bonfires. So if you're gonna wear a zoot suit, you go home with no clothes. Fortunately, no one was actually murdered in these weeks of riots. Finally, they died down. They died down because the suits were banned. All right, we'll stop here and just understand that minorities of all kinds contributed to the war effort, and minorities of every kind suffered to a degree because of it. Probably nobody more directly than Japanese Americans. And the next time I do one of these things, it'll be about this particular situation with Japanese Americans.